Each year, your rabbis sit down and meditate on the words that we want to share during the High Holy Day season. Sometimes the sermon topics are timeless, meaning we could give them any time of year and the impact of the topic could stand the test of time. Other sermons, though they connect to a current event or a moment in the world. Still others fall under another category, a once-in-a-lifetime sermon. Tonight's sermon is one that I do not believe I could give any other time in my life. And I know this may come as a surprise to some of you, as this flattering High Holy Day robe hides it so well. But in case you thought things looked a little different this Erev Rosh HaShanah, I'm blessed to be a little over 35 weeks pregnant. Thank you. And we hear often that we timed it well, as I'll be 40 weeks just after Sukkot. My type A self responds, we cut it a little close. And while masked with some humor, the truth is Max and I thought this was all starting in August. We thought we would be navigating coming back for the High Holy Days at just 8 weeks postpartum. However, that pregnancy didn't go as we had hoped and prayed. Instead, we suffered a pregnancy loss at around 7 weeks back in December. And then, in a quick turnaround of blessings, we became pregnant again in January. Here we are today. Now, I never thought that I would be a rabbi crafting a sermon around miscarriage. Not because I didn't think it could happen to us. We knew the statistics. 10 to 20% of known pregnancies end in miscarriage. And at the time, I didn't realize the universal messages that I would learn from the pain and suffering that we endured. And my hope is that the message I share this evening, that it speaks to everyone, whether or not you relate personally. Basically, don't tune out just because you've heard the topic headline. And though the personal touch of this sermon focuses on one kind of loss, we've all had or will have different types of losses in our lives. And so tonight, I hope that we leave as a more connected community, a braver community, and a community ready to continue lifting up individuals in their times of need. I want to share the full story of what we experienced because it paints a very real picture of the types of isolation that we may find ourselves in, even when we are surrounded by people, colleagues at work, family, friends, and strangers. And I'll tell you the ending now, which is that if I had to go through it all again, I would do it differently. Having done the studying and the reflection, I now feel more equipped with the tools and words that I was missing at the time. It's as if I have some things I would like to share with a younger version of myself, things that would have really helped her, maybe will be helpful to you. You see, I happened to miscarry while being the rabbi on the trip for 19 young Jewish and interfaith couples while on the Honeymoon-Israel trip, which, sidebar, was an absolutely amazing trip when you remove the last part of the story. And for those less familiar, Honeymoon-Israel provides immersive trips to Israel for locally based cohorts of couples with at least one Jewish partner, and they bring along a local rabbi or Jewish professional to help facilitate the trip. And that's the trip that I was on in December. And at this point, we were on our final 36 hours of running around Tel Aviv before our flight home. And being on the trip in only my 7th week of pregnancy, I hadn't shared the news with anyone except my co-staff member. In many circles, it has become quite customary to stay mostly quiet until 14 weeks. This waiting period is rooted in the statistic that I cited earlier, that 10 to 20% of known pregnancies end in miscarriage. But we'll unpack more of that waiting period in a bit. As the events unfolded over the next 36 hours, I knew medically what was taking place. The fetus was not genetically viable, and as much as we wanted that pregnancy to hold, there were other genetic forces at play. And I also knew spiritually and emotionally what was happening. Max and I were about to suffer a real loss. We lost what we dreamed for the past 7 weeks, the loss of expectations for August, the loss of a sense of certainty for where our life was going in the coming months. And I began to compartmentalize. I was in Israel doing a job. My job was to make sure these couples felt connected to each other, to others in the group, and to Israel, to make sure that they were having a positive Jewish experience so that they could come back to Atlanta and continue to build their community. In my mind, I just needed to make it another 48 hours, and I could then take care of myself. The problem with compartmentalizing is that you never really know how well you do it. I doubt I was as fully present as I could have been in those last 36 hours. How could I have been? I kept my suffering to myself and my co-staff in the privacy of my room and put on a brave face out in public, all the while experiencing a private loss that no one could visibly see. This may be your first light bulb moment in my story. How often do you, have you, will you suffer in private and put on a brave face in the public sphere, all while suffering a loss that no one can visibly see? At the time, I did what I thought I needed to do in the moment, and I wouldn't make the same choice again. Health is such a personal matter, sometimes very private, other times very public, most often somewhere in between. We brought the world, we brought our village with us when we went through Zohara's medical journey. For those less familiar, at 3 weeks old, she was diagnosed with a very rare congenital heart defect. At 7 months old, we went to Boston, where one of 2 surgeons in the world was equipped to perform her open heart surgery. We're pleased to report she continues to thrive. Now, we were new parents of a medically complex kid, and we could not have managed it at all without the support of our extended family and our Temple Emanu-El village. But something about the journey of miscarriage felt so different from earlier medical struggles in our family. At this stage in the pregnancy, there were no visible external change. My belly hadn't grown yet. Almost no one knew there was anything to monitor. It wasn't like having a child who couldn't grow or gain weight, something quite noticeable in our updates about Zohara's medical journey. This loss felt invisible because in many ways, it was invisible. But I later realized that something else was at play, something related to Judaism. Part of why things felt so different was because of how I thought Judaism viewed early pregnancy. In Judaism, we have so many superstitions and customs surrounding babies, all having to do with warding away the evil eye, or what our grandparents perhaps called keeping away the ayin hara. Traditionally, a greeting for someone announcing a pregnancy is b'sha'a tova, meaning in good time, or implying may it go well at the right time, rather than a mazel tov, congratulations. And this is done as a recognition that the congrats should wait until the baby is born, because until then, we need to keep the evil eye away. In some Jewish circles, families won't host baby showers or purchase any products prior to birth. Some Jewish families don't share the name they intend to give the baby until after the birth or even the bris or naming ceremony. Even with vast medical improvements, these traditions that date back to much higher infant mortality rates of the days of the shtetls, they've continued to be on our minds, on the minds of Jewish parents today. I mean, we really do a lot to say this life isn't real until it's born, which in Jewish law is very true. However, the warding away of the evil eye and the superstitions built up around the idea that each pregnancy is fragile, it leaves a gap in how parents navigate the 40 weeks of in-between time. As I mentioned earlier, in mainstream society, it's become common practice not to share a pregnancy until crossing that 12 to 14 week mark, when the chances of miscarriage takes a statistical drop. Most online blogs these days, they encourage everyone to work on their own timeline for when they feel comfortable sharing, and everyone should do what's right for them. I just wanted to take the time to mention from the Bima that 14 weeks is a very long time. In many ways, this time is terribly isolating. The first trimester is a time when the birthing parent may feel horrifically sick, all while balancing work, perhaps another child, and trying not to puke on their coworker. All while also not telling more than perhaps their innermost circle that they are in the early stages of pregnancy. And while Judaism does not consider the fetus a life until birth, our tradition does, in fact, recognize the stress that pregnancy puts on parents. Even in the days of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, the community acknowledged that women who became pregnant changed their state of purity. Now, while the language of the rabbis in talking about bringing sacrifices to move from impure to pure doesn't necessarily speak to our modern sensibilities, but the reasoning behind their logic, it should. The whole point of the system was to bring those who suffer back to the community. It's a really big deal. You don't have to study very many texts to understand that the rabbinical system wasn't exactly focused on the needs of women. However, these teachings really make an impact on me because they hold intergenerational knowledge and wisdom that should not be overlooked. In Mishnah Keritot, it's a text from around 200 CE, the rabbis discuss at length the various ritual sacrifices and circumstances surrounding a woman's purification after pregnancy loss. Rabbi Nicole Auerbach, the URJ's Associate Director of Community Building and Leadership, understood the rabbis' struggle as follows. The rabbis acknowledge what we too often seek to ignore, that not all pregnancies end with a child. They insist that even when a pregnancy dissolves into something that resembles only the primordial beginnings of life, we cannot pretend that nothing happened. We must instead ritually recognize that the woman took part, albeit too briefly, in the act of creation. In temple times, those who were impure were instructed to share their impure status, not only to avoid making others impure, but as a grand notification saying, something bad has happened to me. I feel outside of the camp right now, and I need your compassion and prayers to help bring me back. This act acknowledged the loss of a potential life, a potential dream, of a potential child, and the state of aloneness that the grieving mother-to-be was in. When we maintain a culture of keeping pregnancy and pregnancy loss and infertility struggles private for so long, we remove the Jewish space that can provide a public transition into mourning. Rabbi Auerbach noted, if you ask many women why they wait to tell people that they are pregnant, they will tell you they want to avoid having to untell everyone if something goes wrong. But then she went on to teach me. As someone who had to do this, she said, I assure you the untelling is not the hard part. In fact, it can be a surprising source of comfort. And she said, you can also designate someone else to do the untelling for you as a way to lighten the burden. At this point, I'm assuming you have heard something in these systems, in stories that parallel an aspect of loss in your life. Feeling isolated due to an illness, tragic event, or life struggle that goes much deeper than the example of pregnancy loss. And I believe wholeheartedly that we often find God in the telling and untelling of our realities. God is in the compassion that surrounds us when we share our vulnerabilities with other people, with our community. Now, with societal pressures, fear of job loss, fear of taboo or being made an outcast, fear of judgment, people may be weary of sharing the pain that they are going through. Sometimes the struggle is a personal one, and other times it is tangential, supporting family who are going through something heavy. Illness, mental health, addiction, infertility, divorce, suicide, the loss of a loved one. A word of warning, though. When these struggles become our entire identity or define the entirety of our relationship with another person, we end up crossing a boundary. There is a difference between sharing the burden of a struggle and overloading someone else with our woes. If someone crosses that boundary, they should be guided to explore therapy or other sources of help. A key component to the messiness of our struggles is finding the right balance of surrounding ourselves with support systems from family and friends without overburdening them. Some struggles will require professional help to process. Other struggles can be supported through a network of friends, and still others will require a mix of the two. We must strike a balance that prevents the additional burden of loneliness. The reality of our world is that we are simultaneously surrounded by people in the midst of their struggle, those who have overcome the unimaginable, and those who have survived one struggle only to find themselves in the depths of another. Sitting in the liminal space of being surrounded by community while feeling completely alone, it's not a new phenomenon. So much so that tradition has provided us with what is a beautiful template for moving through this kind of despair. I only wish I had studied it sooner. There is a particular piece of Torah that highlights the humble and great leader Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. And the story comes from the Torah portion, Bahalotecha, in the book of Numbers. And then in this particular part of the story, Moses reaches his lowest of emotional lows. The Israelites come to him once again with a complaint, this time complaining about the food, saying they rather return to slavery in Egypt because at least the food was good. This latest complaint, having built upon the sin of the golden calf, complaining about water, and so many other things, this was Moses' final straw. And he had a complete emotional breakdown. So much so that he asked God to take him out of all of his misery. And while Moses did not suffer a personal loss or illness in that moment, he was in an extreme state of despair, completely surrounded by his community, while feeling entirely alone. And when Moses was in another state of despair, a full 2 books of Torah ago, back in the book of Exodus, his father-in-law, Yitro, had recommended that Moses create for himself a court of 70 elders to help share the burden of leading the people. So this infrastructure was already in place. And yet, while he had systems in place, Moses hadn't tapped into them. He felt this way because he hadn't yet spoken to anybody about his problem. And so Moses started by reaching out to one person, or in this case, to one listener, by reaching out to God. And God's response is our lesson. Moses needed to surround himself with others. He needed community, he needed support, and he needed people. But more than that, he needed an extra element of support, a spirit of sorts. And God said, I will come down and speak with you and the elders, and I will draw upon the spirit that is on you and put it on them. They shall share the burden of the people with you, and you shall not bear it alone. God taught Moses that in the midst of despair, he must not be alone, not physically, not spiritually. He had to speak up. Still to this day, Judaism has prioritized being there for people in vulnerable times. We are commanded to visit the sick, comfort the mourner, be there for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. In ancient times, it was easier to recognize those in need. The systems in place required those in despair to come forward to the temple to make their problem known publicly. Today, we have more abilities to connect than ever. Yet some will say, many will say, they have never felt more alone. Myself included, we often don't know how to begin to share the misfortunes that we face. But what I've learned from my latest hardship is that, at least for me, it's easier to move out of despair when we let others in to help. Our task is not easy. In the 21st century, I'm asking us to be vulnerable and to not be alone in our vulnerabilities. My truth is that if I went back in time to that terrible personal struggle of miscarrying while on a group trip, knowing what I know today, I would in fact do things differently. I would have found the right words or the right way to speak my truth and remain my authentic self while leading. But since there is no time machine for redos, I offer my story as one example that I hope will speak to others. I wish I could wave a magic yod, guarantee that none in this space would ever face hardship from this day forward. But the realities of life teach us that this just won't be the case. And so I pray that in 5784, that we should feel empowered to seek out support should we be like Moses in the depths of despair. Moses, the great leader, Moses, the prophet, at times felt a profound sense of despair due to his self-imposed isolation. I pray that we heed God's advice to not go through despair in isolation. I know the power of finding God in the compassion surrounding us when we share our vulnerabilities. And I now know how deep that despair can be when the pressures of society and the taboos of sharing lead us to trudge through certain losses alone. Temple Emanu-El has systems in place to help our congregants through difficult times, whether more privately or publicly. Our Misha Berach list for healing is there to publicly name those who are struggling with health issues, not just as a call of prayer to the heavens, but as a reminder to our community to keep them at the forefront of our minds. So come to Friday night services to be a part of this powerful moment each week. Our caring committee exists because we know that just taking one meal off someone's to-do list or hearing from one person, even a stranger, whose sole reason for reaching out is to express their genuine care, we know that this makes a difference. And your rabbis, we will make time in our schedules to help our members talk through the spiritual side of life's hardships. I pray that we leave tonight entering the year 5784 as a more connected community, a braver community, and a community ready to lift one another up in our times of need.